Hey everyone, FusedVR coming at you. So normally I don't make these types of videos, but I wanted to quickly recap a couple things that I thought were pretty big announcements that have happened over the past couple weeks and document that in this video. And that specifically has to relate to, I think, some important things that are happening within the Cloud XR and remote rendering space, as well as also at the device level, which I think is really worth talking about. And before I dive into any of that stuff, I'd love to know down in the comments below, what is one thing that you're really excited that's been announced within the past 2 weeks? Because there's been a ton of stuff that's been talked about, which I think is really, really cool and exciting to see kind of this life kind of brought back into the VR announcement space. So with that said, let me go ahead and switch here over to desktop mode. And the first thing that I think is definitely worth addressing is the fact that virtual desktop has been officially enabled to support VR streaming directly when you download it from the store. So before this, what you had to do was you buy virtual desktop for I think $15 on the Quest store. You then have to go to SideQuest, you download this odd patch which enables SteamVR remote rendering, and install that onto your headset and install that onto your PC, and that to unlock the feature. And while you have to do that, of course, you have to enable developer mode and you have to go through a pretty lengthy process that I think the average Joe typically never wants to do, right? And so this is a really big deal in the fact that now it's actually integrated to the app, and moreover, I think is a step in Oculus saying they're okay in kind of, if you will, opening up the walled garden a little bit for remote rendering streaming.
Okay, so I'm editing the video, and of course, as I decide to give Facebook praise, they decide to completely undermine exactly what I say, and I'll leave the link to the article from UploadVR where they discuss this in more detail, but basically, supposedly you can't even submit a streaming application to the app lab, not let alone the Quest store in general, which is very weird because they exactly let through virtual desktop. But yeah, it's completely strange, and I don't know how they're going to enforce this, generally speaking. But I still do think that remote rendering is a viable solution, and we'll talk a little bit about devices later in the video. So strange. I have to say, strange move from Facebook, but let me leave it there and back to the video.
And I know there's probably a lot of political junk that happened behind the scenes to make this happen, because none of this stuff happens without negotiations. But at the same time, I think it's a pretty big milestone in the fact that Oculus is saying they're okay with remote streaming of VR content. And I think this will likely mature itself also into, say, Oculus Link at some point. I know Facebook themselves are looking into their own cloud gaming platform. And in general, we're starting to, I think, see this trend that's not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen next year. But I think over 2020, where a lot of rendering will ultimately move to the cloud, or what I personally look at, which is 5G and the edge. And I think that there are, if I'm being frank, there are a lot of hurdles that are in the way of that right now. But from a cost perspective, I think that ultimately will open the doors up to a lot more high fidelity graphics, as well as just reduce the price in general. Because you don't have to deal with heavy, fancy GPUs running on people's heads if you're looking at a mobile device like the Quest. Second thing that's also related to remote rendering is this whole Microsoft Mesh announcement. And it's been kind of funny to watch this because on the one hand, you have a lot of people that are looking at Mesh as kind of this future of spatial computing and being able to build applications. On the flip hand, when I go and look at VR Twitter, everyone is just confused out of their minds as to what this thing is at first glance, myself included, which I was like so busy when this thing came out, and I just like looked at the headlines and I'm like, wait, why is this any different than multiplayer, right? Like all of the multiplayer SDKs that already exist out there. But when you go and dive behind the hood, and I think this technical overview, while there's a lot of fluff here, if I'm going to be pretty honest, does an okay job at explaining some of the advantages of using mesh, and potentially, right? I think one of the key things here is it's a potential, because even in this overview diagram, I think there's a lot of BS that needs to be cut through in order to actually understand what's going on. So the key things are these 4 capabilities. So there's immersive presence, spatial maps, holographic rendering, and multi-user sync. So you can pretty much ignore multi-user sync, because that is basically just multiplayer in a nutshell, which we have plenty of SDKs for. Having it as part of the package is nice, but like, it's not new. Immersive presence is another BS term that I have no idea what this means. They're saying there's some fancy AI that is going to allow you to move your avatars. It could be interesting, but at the same time, with inverse kinematics and there are plenty of SDKs out there that can handle that, it's also not it's not an innovative feature, if you ask me. The 2 that are potentially more interesting are the spatial maps and holographic rendering. So spatial maps is very similar actually to, say, what we cover in the previous video actually, which is Microsoft Spatial Anchors, if I can type. But this is the ability to take a look at the real world, and exactly like what's happening in this image, which doesn't look any different from mesh if you ask me, be able to have 2 devices see the same object and get the spatial coordinates for that object, so that you can sync the virtual data and content around that object. And I think there's probably a little bit of more fancy work that's happening behind the scenes here to make that happen, but that's generally the gist of this. And I think one thing that might be nice is this typically, I think, works just with the AR Core, HoloLens, and iOS and ARKit, whereas this, I think, might be a bit more cross-compatible across, say, VR, AR, you name it. And I think that sounds a little bit more interesting, and hopefully a little bit more easy to integrate than, say, spatial anchors would be across multiple devices. So does it exist? Yes. Is it probably a step up from what we saw before? Also a yes. So in that sense, I think that's pretty interesting. And then going exactly back to the remote rendering topic, you have holographic rendering, which I think I understand why it's not in the marketing material, but this is probably the only thing I'm really at all excited about from Microsoft Mesh. And had this not been here, I might have been a little bit hesitant in actually saying that this is an interesting product. But you could see here, basically, by using either the Edge or Cloud, I think from a practical standpoint, Microsoft is very much looking at the Edge. You have the ability to offload your rendering from your device onto the Edge, and then the Edge handles all of that rendering and sends that back to the device. So if you have something that's very high compute and very intensive, you'll have the ability to actually go ahead and offload that to the Edge. After cutting through layers and layers and layers of marketing BS, I think there is something that is noteworthy here. One real quick thing before we jump to the other topics is, I think the other key factor in whether or not this gets used is how easy this toolkit is to integrate. If it's not easy, I think in kind of the same way that most people don't talk about spatial anchors and most people don't talk about Google Cloud anchors, although they're really powerful technologies, this may or may not end up getting used. And so I think that the Unity SDKs, the Unreal SDKs, they're all going to be extremely vital for how this product ultimately ends up maturing. So we'll see how that plays out. Other quick things, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but HTC Vive has actually gone ahead and started teasing out something. To be honest, who knows what this really is. I think the rumor mill can go wild a little bit with a potential VR headset. We'll see if this becomes the Quest competitor, but I think all the more reason why remote rendering with either mesh or with virtual desktop or plenty of other Cloud XR remote rendering solutions that are out there start to become more prominent. And we'll see what this actually ends up being. But I'd imagine wait for later this year for some form of announcement, and we'll see how it plays out. And lastly, I think it's worth noting here that PlayStation VR 2 will be announcing kind of old news, but I think it's just kind of worth talking about that the device market is heating up, and it's going to be interesting to see where you have this wide range of devices on the one hand that are low end, high end, everything in the middle, and I think PSVR kind of fits in the middle there, mapping to whether or not you want high-end graphics and streaming, and then you have that similar compatibility matrix, and seeing where those devices ultimately end up taking off. Obviously, the Quest has a pretty big lead at the moment, but there's, I don't think, anything stopping in such an early market. Other devices using pretty innovative technology, getting the benefits out of edge and cloud, and making a very compelling product. So curious to see how that plays out. That's just kind of the few things that I noticed that were really interesting and I thought were worth talking about. But again, I'd love to know down in the comments below over the past couple of weeks, what has been something that's really caught your eye in VR. And I think there's a lot of new and interesting stuff that's happening, and this space is just heating up. And I've always said this, we're here for the long haul. I think this thing takes years to ultimately mature and manifest. We're still riding that wave up, and a lot of new and compelling innovations are already happening in this space and are going to continue to be happening in this space. And it's going to be a journey to see how this ultimately ends up maturing, but it's a really exciting one nonetheless. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. It's been Fuse Man, and I'm signing out.